Hello and welcome to the first Eyebrow Cinema Q&A video spectacular. We recently hit 10,000 subscribers, and this seemed a fun way to mark the occasion, do something a little more casual, let my hair down, so to speak, and let you guys ask me some questions. Before I get into that, though, I want to say thank you to all my subscribers and to announce that Eyebrow Cinema now has a Patreon page. So if you like the videos I make and you want to help me make more, you can head on over to patreon.com/eyebrowcinema. For $2 a month, you'll get credit in all my videos, you'll get access to polls to vote on future video topics, and you'll get updates on progress of videos currently in production. If you want to go a step further, there's also a $5 tier, which gets you everything in the first tier, plus an exclusive video just for $5 backers each month. So yeah, if you like the videos we make here and you want to help make more, please head on over to Patreon, and any support is massively appreciated. Alright, on to the main event. Starting things off is Patricia O, who asks, do you think it's unethical to watch movies made by sex offenders like Kevin Spacey or Harvey Weinstein? Way to start with a softball question. Okay, so this is the classic, do we separate the art from the artist debate that's been going on for many years, and we're not gonna come close to settling it here. Frankly, I'd feel a little bit uncomfortable trying to provide a one-size-fits-all answer to this question because it's a really complex topic. Really, all I can do is speak for myself in terms of answering this question, because I think everyone needs to kind of come to their own judgments about when it is and isn't okay to engage with art made by problematic people. I also think you have to break down the question into two different parts, because there's a difference between asking, is it okay for me to enjoy this art made by a problematic person? And is it okay for me to financially support this art made by a problematic person? Regarding the first question, it really comes down to you. Do you still enjoy the work knowing what someone has done? And if you do, then I think you can keep enjoying it. And if you don't, well, maybe you need to let that thing go. Personally, I tend to skew closer to still being able to enjoy works made by bad people who have done bad things. But it is complicated, and my relationship to that text changes. Kevin Spacey is actually a perfect example of this. If you take a movie like American Beauty, I really like that movie. I really like Kevin Spacey's performance in it. But it is a different experience to watch that movie and watch Spacey play a character who lusts after a teenager when we know he's assaulted underage boys. That just can't help but factor into the viewing experience, or at least it's something that I can't help but think about. I also think there's a difference then between, can you enjoy a work made by someone who's done bad things and has hurt people, and can you financially support it? Because while I'm okay with, say, rewatching Roman Polanski films or buying them on DVD or Blu-ray, I would be a lot more queasy about going to see a Polanski movie, a newly released Polanski movie in the theaters, and giving him that kind of financial support, and with it, that endorsement. So that's my really kind of unsatisfying answer to that really complex question. You kind of need to weigh it for yourself and deem what you still can bear to do emotionally and what you still think is right. If you're interested in this topic, though, this art versus the artist debate, Sarah Z and Lindsay Ellis have both done really great videos on if J.K. Rowling's transphobia ruins the Harry Potter series, and I know that the specifics of what you're asking about is not the same as what they're talking about, but that underlying core of art versus the artist is there, and they're really good and offer up more discussion. Potty asks, have you ever reached out to any aspiring filmmakers popular on YouTube? If yes, do you have any interesting insight to share? Not really. Probably the closest I've come to really reaching out to a popular YouTuber would be a couple weeks ago. I noticed the YouTuber Quentin Reviews had put my Indiana Jones in the Face of Jewish Vengeance video essay in a playlist of the best video essays of 2019. So I sent him a tweet just to say, hey, thank you, it meant a lot to me. And he tweeted back saying, oh yeah, it was a great video. So that was cool, but I haven't really reached out to any bigger film YouTubers and been like, hey, what do you think of my stuff? Sup asks, what are your favorite films? Have you ever thought about directing or writing films yourself? Do you read a lot? Well, according to Letterboxd, my favorite movies are The Godfather Part 2, Doctor Strangelove, Citizen Kane, and Seven Samurai. Maybe those are cliche picks, but I love them all so much. Have I ever thought about writing or directing my own movies? Not really. I mean, I did a little bit in school, both high school and university, on various projects, and enjoyed the process, but at the end of the day, I don't think that's what I am really passionate about and would like to do. I think I'm much more suited to this kind of film analysis. To your question of do I read a lot? Yes, but mostly academic texts. I'm still a student, so I spend a lot of time reading film analysis books and articles and essays, so I don't read as much fiction as I used to, although I did recently start rereading Isaac Asimov's Foundation trilogy. I'm currently on the book Second Foundation, which is the third in the trilogy. Frollo Baggins asks, would you ever consider making a letterboxed account so we can see all the films you've watched without having to ask you constantly, have you watched X? Follow-up question, are there any more animated films you'd potentially make an essay for? Akira and Miyazaki films namely come to mind. I do have a letterboxed account. You can find me on there under the name Daniel P.G. Simpson. I've been an active user since, I think, 2012. I've been there for a while, and I am a pretty active user. I don't always post consistently, but when I do post, they're pretty substantial reviews. So, yeah, if you like the channel, you'll probably like the reviews I post there. As to your second question, will I ever do a video on any more animated films? I actually do have a very early outline for a Pixar video scripted. I should preface that by saying it's just an outline. I don't actually have a full functioning script, but I have the basic beats plotted out. I don't know when or even if I'll get around to that video, but I think it's a fun idea, so that's a probably decent bet that'll come eventually. And as for Akira and Miyazaki, I don't have any plans currently, but never say never. I love Akira. It was probably the first anime film that I saw that I really responded to. And Miyazaki, I've seen, I think, all of his feature films, and I'm generally a fan. So yeah, there's a very high possibility that I will make a video on those topics at some point or another. Liaison Media asks, do you write your scripts first as full-blown essays word for word, or do you just kind of make bullet points about the elements you want to cover and riff from there? I definitely write my videos as full-blown essays right from the start. I would not be able to riff and make anything coherent at a video essay level. Frankly, just doing this unscripted is kind of a struggle for me. Very rarely while I'm recording, I'll think that an idea is not resonating fully and I can really hammer it home or expand and improv a line in the moment while I'm recording, but that's not super common and it's only usually one or two lines. But for the most part, I script pretty thoroughly, so by the time I'm in the editing process, I have a really strong foundation to work on, because I think improving video essays would be kind of a nightmare. Longtime viewer DW Rocket asks, what's your biggest film hot take? Congrats on 10K. Thank you, DW. Biggest film hot take is probably that I don't like Sicario very much. I think it's a very well-made movie. It certainly looks amazing. You know, Roger Deakins is peerless as a cinematographer, but at its core, I think it's kind of a dumb film, despite the fact that it walks the sort of line of being this prestige, dignified, serious, hard-hitting movie about the drug trade. I don't think it says anything more intelligent than this kind of really basic theme of, you know, to fight monsters, you must become a monster. It just feels kind of cliche to me and feels like it's born less out of the reality of what the drug trade is like and more a sort of tough guy macho action movie idea about what that's like. So overall, I mean, I definitely don't hate Sicario. As I said, it's very well made, but I remember the conversation around that movie being so generally enthusiastic in its praise, and I felt pretty on the sidelines for that, because despite the filmmaking qualities, I think it's kind of basic on a story level and thematic level, and I think if you want a really rich movie about the drug trade, you're better off still with Steven Soderbergh's Traffic, which is fantastic. Shiva asks, what is your favorite and least favorite movie, TV show, or video game, and why? So I'll blast through these fairly quickly. Favorite movie is The Godfather Part 2. Favorite TV show is Batman the Animated Series. Favorite video game is Bloodborne. Godfather 2 and Batman I have videos on, so I think you can watch those to get a sense of why I like them so much. As for Bloodborne, I think it's just an exemplar of narrative in a video game and interactive storytelling, and the combat is just really darn fun. Least favorite for all of those is a lot harder. I've definitely watched my share of bad movies and TV shows, less so bad video games because I play a lot less games, so the games I do play tend to be pretty good for the most part. The worst games I play are still, you know, decent. And I don't like to dwell too much on the bad media I consume, because even bad movies I find educational in their own way. But you did ask, and I should give an answer for at least one of those least favorites. So I'll say least favorite TV show, Dr. Phil, because the guy seems like an asshole. Yggdrasil asks, what inspired you to start making YouTube videos, and what advice would you give to people who want to create a channel of their own? Great question. In terms of what inspired me to start making videos, I had been writing movie reviews on a WordPress blog for a number of years, and while I enjoyed that for a time, towards the end I was starting to get pretty burnt out. I wasn't super passionate about what I was writing, and the reviews themselves were getting kind of not very good, not very interesting. And the audience was certainly shrinking. I was getting so low traffic that as much as I said, oh, I write for me, I don't write for an audience, it was disheartening to see the channel just, or I guess the website, slide into irrelevance. And YouTube seemed an opportunity to do a lot of different things, to reach a much bigger audience, to work with a new medium of video and audio editing instead of just the written word, and to reinvent the type of content I make. Because my old reviews, while I don't think they were terrible, were very much just, should you see this movie or shouldn't you? Whereas the videos I make here, I think, are more analytical and more interesting. So in terms of what advice I'd give to anyone wanting to start their own YouTube channel, no matter on what topic, I would just say the primary thing I would say is make videos on things that interest you. As much as it's tempting to chase trends and try to predict what's going to be popular and capitalize on that, if you don't have a passion for the thing you're working on, you're probably not going to have much of interest to say about it. And I think it reflects in the work. Even if it does become popular, you probably won't be very satisfied with it, and you'll want, as a creator, to do something closer to what interests you. So stick to topics that you actually care about. And also because as much as it's easy to think, oh, I'll chase the popular topics and that'll get a lot of hits, it's not a guarantee. Certainly in my experience, the videos I've done that are the most popular, by and large, were ones that I thought were pretty niche and only for a pretty minor audience, but they've ended up being the biggest hits on my channel. So yeah, just pursue the things that interest you on YouTube. Parker M asks, what is one film that never got made that you wished had? For me personally, it would have been Sergio Leone's Leningrad, The 900 Days. Great question. Speaking of Leone, I know after The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, he said he wanted to remake Gone with the Wind, which would have been fascinating. You know, if you consider Leone as both sort of reverence and awe for classic Hollywood mixed with his almost irreverent disdain for the myths of American history, I think he could have done something really fascinating and subversive with Gone with the Wind. I'm not sure I wish we got it instead, because what we did get in real life was Once Upon a Time in the West, which is not only, I think, one of the best movies ever made, but I think you see a lot of Gone with the Wind in it. Certainly, I think in Once Upon a Time in the West, you see a shared interest in property and ownership and how that informs power throughout history. And there's a shot when Jill first arrives in the town at the beginning and comes off the train, where the camera goes up and you see the, townscape that is reproduced almost entirely from Gone with the Wind. So in a way, I guess we got his Gone with the Wind movie, but it's still fun to wonder what if. And speaking of, Leone unfilmed projects, it's worth pondering what his Godfather would have been. I think a lot of people say, oh, well, we saw his Godfather, it was Once Upon a Time in America. But I think that, Leone in the early 70s making The Godfather, coming off of the massive hits of the Dollars trilogy, would have turned out pretty different than him making Once Upon a Time in America in the 1980s after struggling to get the film made for so long and realizing probably that it was going to be his last film. I think, would have led to two very different movies. So I can't say I wish we had that instead, because the Coppola Godfather films are very dear to me and, of course, are just huge in film history, but it's worth pondering. And then a final one I'll say is Orson Welles' King Lear, just because the idea of late in his life Orson Welles playing King Lear in a film he's directing just sounds amazing. Welles, what he wanted to do with it doesn't sound too amazing, where he wanted to shoot it all in VHS and largely in close-up as a sort of anti-spectacle, which is an interesting idea. I think also might have been an actual nightmare to watch, but I love Welles' Shakespeare movies so much that I can't help but kind of wonder about what that would have looked like. So yeah, I'll say Leone's Gone with the Wind and Godfather, and Welles' King Lear. Would have loved to see those. Speaking of Leone, Randall Clark asks, any chance you will do more videos on Sergio Leone's work? I'd love to see a video essay on some of his lesser-known movies, such as Duck You Sucker, which is a wonderful but underrated film. I also really like that film. Will I do more Leone film videos? Probably. Simply through metrics, it would make sense to do. My most popular video by far is the Once Upon a Time in America piece, and the Once Upon a Time in the West video also did very well on my channel. So will I go back to Leone? There's a decent bet. And in fact, those 2 videos came out of me working as a teaching assistant for a course that was largely the works of Sergio Leone. So I'd spent a semester reading about his films and rewatching them and discussing them with the professor and with students. So he's definitely a filmmaker who I've studied pretty thoroughly and have a lot of opinions and feelings about. So yeah, there's a decent chance we'll see more Leone videos in the future. New one asks, who is your favorite director? Probably a toss-up between Kubrick, Kurosawa, Scorsese, Hitchcock, and Paul Thomas Anderson. Not the most original choices, again, but I love their movies so much. Alter-Ego asks, what is the origin of your name? So on one level, I really love the pun on Eyebrow Cinema, because it implies that the channel is going to talk about really prestigious, dignified art movies, but also that I don't take myself super seriously, and I'm hoping to have fun with it. But at the end of the day, the real reason it's Eyebrow Cinema is just quite simply, I needed a name that was very clearly about movies, and that was unique and catchy, without it being like, damn the movie man's movie reviews. So I thought Eyebrow Cinema was simple and elegant and clear, and I like how it sounds. And actually, if you look at my channel, you'll notice that it was first created in like April of 2016, despite me not actually publishing a video until December of 2017, which is simply because I came up with the name well before I knew I really wanted to make videos, but I thought this is a good name and you should lock it down now before someone else takes it. Timon asks, did you study film theory or something similar? Yeah. So in undergrad, I was a minor in film. I wrote my master's thesis on the Hollywood production code and the films of Mae West, and now I'm currently a graduate student studying screen cultures and curatorial studies, but in effect, it's film studies. So yeah, I've been studying film for quite a while. Stir asks 2 questions. First, since you always talk about films, I just wanted to know what are some of your favorite TV series, and do you have a schedule or something similar to decide what films you're going to watch, or do you just decide at the time what you're going to watch? So favorite show I mentioned already, Batman the Animated Series was hugely formative to me, both as a child and then as a teenager. And even now as an adult, still means a lot to me and I think still really holds up. But really for the most part, I don't watch too much television. Most of the shows I watch tend to be older and older comedies specifically. A lot of The Simpsons, a lot of Futurama, It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. Also Garth Marenghi's Dark Place, which seems like a show a lot of YouTubers really like. You can find the whole series on YouTube. There's only like 6 episodes, and they're really amazing. So Batman the Animated Series is definitely my favorite, and otherwise it's just a lot of comedy. As for my watch schedule, I find that lately what dictates most of my watching is just whatever happens to be expiring from the Criterion channel. So while I don't officially like schedule out my watches, there is sort of a external thing motivating what I watch. Anand asks, would you ever want to do a video on John Ford? I enjoy his movies and think it would be wonderful to see an analysis of him, whether in his more famous films or in some of the movies that may not be as famous, like Cheyenne Autumn or Seven Women. I'd love to do a video on John Ford. I think he's one of the best old Hollywood directors, and films like Stagecoach and The Searchers in particular are favorites of mine. And there's such great tension to work out with Ford in how his films, his westerns largely informed our own mythic conception of the American West, and yet you see in later movies like The Searchers and, as you mentioned, Cheyenne Autumn, his own tensions with that legacy and his efforts to unpack it as tepid as they might be. The Searchers in particular is a film that I really love and I think about a lot because it's so fraught with contradiction. It is a racist movie that is about racism, and while there is definitely tension in those two things, in that tension, I think it paints a really fascinating portrait of racial hatred and racial violence. So, yeah, I don't have any definite plans for a John Ford video at the moment, but he's definitely someone I'd love to talk about. Jose asks, you are entrusted with a very special mission. Ooh. It's the eve of the apocalypse, but you can only save 2 films. Your mission is to pick 2 films, seal them in a time capsule, and then send them into outer space. This is in the hopes that they will mate like bunnies and produce cinematic offspring which will preserve our beloved art form. Which 2 films would you pick and why? Great question. Lovely dramatic framing. So my first pick is probably going to be Citizen Kane, which I know is a boring choice in some ways and the predictable choice, but beyond its historical importance, I still think it's just an amazing example of cinematic storytelling, of using mise-en-scène cinematography, editing, and sound to tell your story and not just dialogue. So Citizen Kane is my first pick. For my second pick, I want to go with something a little more contemporary, and I think I'm going to go with Barry Jenkins' film If Beale Street Could Talk, which is just a really beautiful movie that didn't get anywhere near the recognition it deserved to. Although it definitely has a fan base, so hopefully that'll continue to grow as the years go by. It's a beautifully made film. It has really excellent performances, and I also think it's just an amazing example of screenwriting, specifically for how it doesn't adhere to usual screenplay structures. There's a lot from Baldwin's novel in terms of side characters that only show up in one scene, or some of the protagonist's external monologue that a more streamlined adaptation probably would have cut. But I really respect Jenkins for keeping that material in, because I think it enriches the overall film so much. Also, just as a portrait of humanity, I guess, both in terms of the film's socio-political critique of racism in America, but also as just this really tender portrait of people and love. I think it offers a lot. So yeah, Citizen Kane and If Beale Street Could Talk. That's my two-time Capsule films. May they replenish cinema as an art form in our apocalyptic future. Fravel asks, what are your thoughts on Ghibli? Favorite movie? Also, do you think services like Netflix will affect cinemas and television, and in what way? I'm definitely a fan of Studio Ghibli. I wouldn't say that I'm like a hardcore fan. I haven't seen all of their films quite yet. They certainly set a really high bar in animation, though I do think there's a pretty clear divide between the movies made by Miyazaki and Takahata and the movies made by everyone else. Not to say movies like Whisper of the Heart or Ocean Waves or The Secret World of Arrietty are bad by any stretch of the imagination, but none of them come close to inspiring me like the best of Miyazaki or Takahata, and certainly no one else at that studio is as wildly adventurous in terms of visual filmmaking and visual style as Takahata. You take a movie like My Neighbors the Yamadas, and it's certainly not my favorite Ghibli movie, but you gotta give it credit because nothing else from the studio looks anything like it. So I like the studio a lot overall, but I don't necessarily worship at their altar. As far as favorite Ghibli films go, it's definitely Grave of the Fireflies. Not just my favorite anime film, but my favorite animated film, period, of any form. So, yeah. And will Netflix affect cinema and television? I mean, I think they already have in pretty profound ways. The fact that for so many people, the primary way they consume film and TV is through streaming is a huge shift to our media landscape that I think we're still just feeling the effects for. What does that mean long-term for the future? I don't know. I certainly see a lot of benefits. It's hard to argue with the convenience of streaming, being able to pay a monthly fee and having access to hundreds of titles. But at the same time, I do think it tends to the overwhelming amount of options can devalue individual titles. It's harder for individual things to stand out because we're just awash in it. And even if you pick something to watch, there's almost a sense of FOMO of like, okay, but I could be watching something else. And in terms of film production, I'm tremendously grateful for Netflix in some ways for giving the resources for movies like Roma and The Irishman, which would have been extraordinarily hard, if not impossible, to fund at that level from major Hollywood studios. But at the same time, the trade-off is so many people can only see them on streaming, and these are really great films that deserve the opportunity to be seen in a theater if you can, and it's a shame that that doesn't happen. Joshua asks, what are some of your favorite movies from the new Hollywood late 60s to mid-70s era? Also, what's a widely disliked movie that you think is legitimately great? So New Hollywood is probably my favorite era of Hollywood filmmaking. It's certainly up there anyway. I mean, there's just such a great collection of amazing films. I could just rhyme off quickly, Bonnie and Clyde, The Graduate, The Godfather 1 and 2, Chinatown, Taxi Driver, The Last Picture Show, Paper Moon, The Exorcist, The French Connection. There's tons and tons and tons of amazing films. The new Hollywood was just quite simply exceptional at taking, these really art house movies really that were daring and challenging and even a little bit experimental, and yet also were mainstream hits that could play to a wide audience. And that sort of synergy has never really been replicated in Hollywood. And I think when people look back nostalgically on 70s Hollywood, that's why, because it was this golden age where a lot of the best films of the year were also the most popular. So my favorite of the era is probably pretty clearly The Godfather Part 2, but since I've talked about that a lot, I'll quickly highlight Bonnie and Clyde, which is usually credited as the first film of the new Hollywood, and I think rightfully so, looking at the timeline. And it's certainly an exemplar of the attitudes and values of New Hollywood, the fact that it's this film that is at once deeply rebellious and anti-authority, and yet is also this really exciting crowd pleaser. To the point that I think in some ways Bonnie and Clyde's legacy overshadows the film itself, kind of like with Citizen Kane, where people can't get past the fact that it's the greatest movie of all time. that they almost can't see it as just a movie. Bonnie and Clyde similarly is so noted in film history for revolutionizing the gangster movie and modernizing it, for destroying the production code, for launching the new Hollywood, that it's easy to forget that it's also just a really great movie, that it's an exciting story brought to life with amazing actors and a wonderful script. Certainly when I watched it for the first time in high school, I knew it was important, but I didn't know the exact context. I just loved it because I thought it was a really exciting story. So maybe not my absolute favorite of the new Hollywood, but in some ways still the first and the ultimate new Hollywood movie. As far as a movie that's widely disliked that I think is legitimately great, this might shock a lot of the people who commented on my fan entitlement video that I just hate Zack Snyder, but I really love Man of Steel. And no, I will not defend that opinion. Aditya asks, are you a fan of David Lynch? If you are, what is your favorite and least favorite film of his? I am a fan of David Lynch, but it took me a long time to get there. The first Lynch film I saw was Mulholland Drive when I was 14, and I had no idea what I was getting myself into, and I largely hated it. I just found it frustrating and just infuriating and hard to watch. I didn't get, not just that I didn't get the story, but I didn't get the techniques or why Lynch was making the choices he's made. I've since come to really love that movie with rewatches and with time, and as I've gotten older and a bit more sophisticated in my film viewing, and also just have a better sense of what I'm getting into. And I've seen most of his films at this point. I'm missing a couple still, but I think I'm definitely a fan. I think the film that really sold me on him was Eraserhead, which is a bit strange because it's his most openly surreal and bizarre, but I think that in a way helped me because it was just clear from the start that this is taking place in a nightmarish alternate world, so I could kind of go into that knowingly. And there's also a really clear thematic through line about this guy who is not ready to be a father and is terrified of what that means for him. And that kind of acted as a Rosetta Stone, where after that point I felt I could go to Lynch movies and was a lot more open to them. It's probably still my favorite David Lynch movie, although The Elephant Man comes really close just because it's such an emotionally touching film. And I find it fascinating that Lynch was able to take what could have been a very ham-fisted, clumsy biopic story in the wrong hands, inject it with his own dark, surreal visual style, and yet still maintain that emotional core. I think that's probably what works about David Lynch so much, is that beneath his weird sense of humor and mixing of violence and generally surreal filmmaking, there is such strong emotional cores to all of his movies that makes it easy, maybe not easy, but that makes it possible to latch onto and invest in, even if you don't totally understand on a story level. Least favorite David Lynch movie? Probably Dune, which I know is his opinion as well. He's mostly disowned the film. It's not terrible. It certainly has some really interesting production design, and the cast in it is just completely wild, which is neat to see. But it definitely is a confusing mess of a film that really struggles to adapt the massive novel it's based on. And I also don't think Lynch was ever really super comfortable dealing with material that was so dense in plot and lore. I think his films work better when they're a lot more abstract, and there's sort of a simple narrative that he can expand on with his own quirky sensibilities, rather than really dense material that he has to hold back his own sensibilities. Miles asks, what's a popular trend in modern day cinema that you just can't stand? Ooh. So this is tougher than I thought it would be to answer, in part because with theaters being closed for the last several months, I can't even remember what modern cinema looks like. Trend I can't stand, probably the live-action Disney remakes, just because they feel so soulless and corporate, and so cynically clearly designed just to exploit 90s kids' nostalgia now that they've come of age, as it were. Granted, I feel a little bit bad saying this is my most hated trend, because I actually haven't seen any of the live-action Disney remakes since Beauty and the Beast in 2017, which was really bad, and that's why I haven't seen any of the others since. But part of it is less the movies themselves and more what they represent, and that being the corporate stranglehold Disney holds over the modern filmmaking landscape. And also, I just find it a little bit disheartening to see these remakes, every time they come out, be this, like, cinematic event. I was thinking about this recently when I watched the Glenn Close live-action 101 Dalmatian movies for the first time from 1996 and 2000. Really bad movies, to be clear, but they made me weirdly nostalgic because those films were very much novelties made for little children, and that's what they were pretty much solely understood as. And now the live action Lion King, for example, is like makes $1 billion and is one of the highest grossing films of the year, even though no one you meet seems to even like it. Bat Devil Spawn asks, do you think there are filmmakers and specific films which are important for their at the time novel use of certain narrative or craft techniques, but have been expanded upon and done better by others? If so, any examples? Also, in your video on Once Upon a Time in America, you didn't mention the gangster films Mean Streets and The Killing of a Chinese Bookie. I would be especially interested to hear your opinion, especially on the latter and maybe even on John Cassavetes in general. So in terms of films that were important for their time but have somewhat been eclipsed by later works, I think there's definitely a lot of examples of that. Really, anything that's primary importance was a technological breakthrough tends to age a lot more poorly and date quicker. The Jazz Singer is probably the best example of that. As the first sound film, it is clearly a major milestone in film history, and for the time, you can imagine how significant that shift would have been. Watching the film now, it's not too engaging. The basic story of a young man who wants to follow his dreams and his dad who says, no, you have to follow tradition, is fine, I guess, but it's not terribly engaging or exciting. And then, of course, there's a lot of blackface in the movie, which is not uncommon in old Hollywood, but it's certainly unpleasant to watch, so that hasn't aged super well. A movie like The Robe from 1953, which was the first film shot in CinemaScope widescreen, certainly an important technique for expanding the canvas quite literally and giving films bigger, epic scope. The Robe itself is pretty boring and unexceptional. I don't remember a thing about it. I know I saw it and that Richard Burton was in it, but just not a very engaging story at all, and its importance is just as a footnote in a textbook about being the first CinemaScope film. I might also argue that a lot of the early silent films from like the first 5 years of the medium, I don't want to say they've dated because they're still these fascinating time capsules of an era long gone, but I also don't think we as a culture can fully imagine what it would have been like to watch those movies for the first time. We live in a culture that's so awash with moving imagery all the time that to really put yourself in the headspace of someone who isn't accustomed to that, seeing movies for the first time, I don't think we can really do that. So while I still think those films are valuable and definitely worth looking at, people interested in the history of the medium, I don't think we can fully, viscerally understand how amazing it would have been to see those for the first time. And then, of course, there's The Birth of a Nation, which Kyle Colgren has a video on that I think is really excellent, but that's another movie that is often talked about as, oh, you have to ignore the racism to admire the brilliant filmmaking. I would disagree. I think if you're just interested in the filmmaking, you can see it in other films, both inspired by Birth of a Nation or they have come after, or also films from before Birth of a Nation that were doing a lot of the things that Nation ended up getting the credit for inventing when it really didn't. Really, if you are going to watch Birth of a Nation, I think it should be to address the racist elements of the film, not to ignore them and admire the filmmaking, but to analyze its racist worldview, because it's a worldview that still has a lot of influence and power today. So yeah, that's another film that I think its technical achievements are largely dwarfed, and you don't need to go to it for that. As far as Mean Streets and The Killing of a Chinese Bookie, the reason I didn't talk about Mean Streets in the gangster film video is just because it didn't really fit talking about the new Hollywood gangster. I love Mean Streets. I think it's one of Scorsese's best. But despite having some of the aesthetics of the gangster film, and certainly the poster is very gangster movie-esque, it really plays more like a coming-of-age drama than it does a mafia movie. So I felt like it didn't really fit, even though it might technically count as a crime drama. As for The Killing of a Chinese Bookie, I know I saw the film, but it's been quite a while, and I wouldn't really be able to talk about it in any sort of meaningful sense. Cassavetes in general is a filmmaker I want to see a lot more of. In addition to The Killing of a Chinese Bookie, I've seen Shadows, which I didn't love, but I thought was really interesting as a example of, like a pioneering example of independent cinema from the 1950s. And I've also seen Opening Night, which I thought was fantastic, and Gina Rollins' performance was amazing. Lord Slamzer asks, what do you think is the best James Bond film? Definitely From Russia with Love. It's the perfect blend of comic book silliness and the comic book world of 007 with a semi-respectable Cold War thriller. Also, I love the collection of villains, especially Robert Shaw's Red Grant, and the final parade of action set pieces is just really awesome. Michael asks, favorite horror film of the 2010s? Definitely The Witch. It's been a great couple years for horror. I loved Us, Midsummer, Hereditary. If you count The Lighthouse as a horror film, although it's kind of its own thing, but nothing has really matched the awe I felt watching The Witch in theaters, having not seen a trailer, knowing very little about it, and just feeling completely absorbed in the film and terrified with what was happening. So that's definitely my favorite horror film of the decade. Probably my favorite horror film since The Silence of the Lambs, if I'm being totally honest. Yeah, just an amazing piece of filmmaking. The other guy asks, what new and up-and-coming director has caught your attention? Several. I mean, if I were to rhyme off just very quickly, Jordan Peele, Barry Jenkins, Robert Eggers, Greta Gerwig, Lula Wang, Ari Aster. I mean, there's so many amazing filmmakers who just in the last couple of years have only made 1 or 2 movies and have really emerged as major talents. I can't wait to see what they make next. Batman Ultra 7 asks, tell me what you want to see in superhero movies that used to be in them or haven't ever. I'm not really sure if I have specific things I want to see. Sorry, my cat was coming up. So much as there's general things that I'd like to see, which mainly are just filmmakers making superhero films from the heart that they're passionate about and that is really personal to them. It's why I think Guardians of the Galaxy 2 is the best of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, because it really feels like it's dealing with personal feelings and emotions in a really powerful way. So yeah, I don't necessarily need to see darker superhero movies or more violent or funnier or anything like that. Just more superhero films that are coming from the heart, as cliche as that might sound. Videos Jacked asks, how's the weather? Hot, hence the sweat. But also sunny, which is good because the lighting in my apartment is largely shit. So, Shiva asks, face reveal? Here it is. I'm sure I look exactly how you expected me to. The BT Skink asks, what is a movie-making trick that still reels you in despite repeated attempts to recreate it? Conversely, what is a common filmmaking trope that if given the chance you would lock away never to be reused for another 20 years? Interesting. I don't know if this is too general, but in terms of a filmmaking, technique I always really like, anytime a flashback is darkly contextualized by what we know happens to the characters in the future, I love that. Is it super cheap that in the penultimate scene of The Godfather Part 2, Fredo is the only one who tries to congratulate Michael for joining the army because we know what happens in that relationship? Yeah, it's really cheap. Does it hit me like a punch in the chest? Also, yes. Movies like Blue Valentine and Harakira, the 1962 film, also do interesting things with having the flashbacks inform the flash forwards and vice versa. Anytime filmmakers play with that and do it in a way that's clear, I love that. In terms of a filmmaking trope that I would be happy to see go away for at least 20 years, probably the liar revealed, because it's never fun. It's always just tedious to go through the motions of, the exposed liar and the outrage and coming back to redeem oneself. It's always just a bore. I think movies like The Force Awakens and Aladdin only really get away with it because there's so much happening in the story when the liar is revealed that there isn't really time for the dramatic, you lied to me. So, yeah. I think the only movie that does the liar revealed well is probably Galaxy Quest because it's contextualized quite differently in that film. And also that movie's just wonderful and creative and really fun. So, yeah, the liar revealed can go away. Matt the Snapper asks, what's your favorite Pixar film? Definitely WALL-E. I love Pixar for the most part. I think they've made some really amazing stuff, but WALL-E is just a perfect blend of what they're exceptional at, this sort of adventure chase movie. It's a great romance. It's very funny. There's so much physical comedy in that film that's just really good. And it also strives to go further at in terms of filmmaking craft, the fact that the first 40 minutes are largely dialogue free is amazing. And its thematic critique of consumerism is really quite bold and brave, and I think lands with a lot of power. So WALL-E's definitely my favorite. The Redheaded Jedi asks, what exactly is a movie? The shit I spend too much time talking about on the internet. Ross McEntire of the YouTube channel Ross McEntire asks, what's the movie you were most excited for that got delayed by COVID? All of them. Honestly, I think I miss going to the theater more than I miss any specific film. I was definitely excited for Tenet and The French Dispatch. I was very excited for No Time to Die, to the point that I had a Bond video put out a month before to tie into the release, and then it got delayed. So there's definitely a lot of specific movies that have been delayed so far and probably more to come that really sting. But overall, it's just the experience of going to the theater and seeing a film on the big screen in a distraction-free environment that I really miss. So hopefully theaters survive this pandemic, and when, we can start going out again, they're able to still be there, because I really miss it. I really, really miss it. Lang asks, films that leave on an open ending or a closed ending? I guess the main answer is whatever the story requires, but I tend to be a fan of films that can kind of do both. Films that have a layer of being open, but at the same time, the final scene feels like a definitive final scene. Chinatown's probably the best example of that, where the last scene of Chinatown feels like the last scene in the movie. It is the ultimate peak for the characters and story in terms of emotion, and you can't imagine anything coming after. And yet, one does wonder what happens to those characters afterward. I suppose I could watch The Two Jakes to find out, but I haven't seen it yet, so one day. Jordan asks, what do you consider the seminal chamber drama? I think it has to be 12 Angry Men. I mean, it's such a pure example of the chamber drama, where it is, with the exception of the very first scene and the very last scene, the entire thing is set in one room in real time, watching a bunch of people argue, and it's such riveting drama, both as a societal critique on the criminal justice system and the inherent racism both within it and within larger American society, but also just this surface level drama where we watch juror number 8 slowly try to convince the table over to not guilty, and it's so riveting. And I also love how Sidney Lumet dramatizes and visualizes this change, where his frames keep getting tighter and tighter on the actors, so you really feel the claustrophobia and the mounting tension of being stuck in this room as the emotions get higher and higher. I think there's also something to be said about the fact that it's a film that really resonates with people who don't watch old movies. I know a lot of people who don't watch a lot of black and white movies and would probably try to avoid watching them if they could, but who think 12 Angry Men is pretty great. And there's something to be said about that kind of power, so... if you want a more obscure chamber drama, I'm going to recommend Robert Altman's Secret Honor, which is a 90-minute movie where Philip Baker Hall plays Richard Nixon in his New Jersey study, post-presidential disgrace, having just a breakdown into his tape recorder while drinking. And you would go in, at least I went in thinking, okay, this movie's probably going to be kind of slow. It's just one guy just talking to himself. It's probably going to have a lot of lulls. Not at all. It's blistering. It's almost overwhelming. Nixon, as played by Hall, is so desperate and manic and really pitiful in a lot of ways that he just is almost ferocious in his actions, even though it's just him talking in a room. I could not keep my eyes off the screen. And also with the film, I remember thinking, how are they going to end this? Because it's just Nixon talking. Like, what possible climax could they have for this movie? That movie has such a fantastic ending, final shot and sounds that just completely blew me away. So 12 Angry Men is probably still the peak of the chamber drama, but Secret Honor is pretty darn awesome. And the fact that it is so simple, of one guy in one room, really says a lot about its quality. Brooke, aka my girlfriend, asks, what's your favorite anime, you weeb? Which, Brooke, we live together. You could have asked me this over breakfast. Knights of the Zodiac. Twitch streamer Millhouse asks, did Treasure Planet really sink Disney animation? I mean, yes and no. Any major corporation like Disney that's as big and complex as it is, it's never just one thing. But certainly Treasure Planet is a financial flop that their animation division has never seen the likes of before or since. I think the real shame is, did Treasure Planet deserve that reputation? And I don't think it does. It's certainly far from a perfect movie, but it's really interesting in a lot of ways. I love the blending of old-timey pirate aesthetics with science fiction. The film plays a lot more with those elements than I really expected them to. And I also really like that the villain and hero don't just have a relationship, but they actually really like each other. And they're torn because their goals put them on opposite sides, even though they have this real affection. I don't think the film handles this story perfectly, but it's certainly a unique relationship in terms of Disney's villains, and I wish they'd play with that idea more. Zach of the YouTube channel Wild Flicks asks, what was the biggest thing you learned starting out? Basically everything. I'd never really edited by myself before I started making video essays. The few times I had was really under the supervision of a friend while we were working on a project together. So I had to learn a lot from scratch. But in terms of like general concepts, I think mainly the main thing I learned early was how to use the video essay as a format to help tell your points. So not just having a script that articulated an argument, but using the video itself, letting the film speak for itself. So if you look back on that first video I made, Why Night of the Living Dead Matters, you'll notice that a lot of the times I'll cut to film footage from either Night of the Living Dead or other films from the era I'm talking about, and have different montages or different, at the end of a sentence, cut to this clip, using the footage kind of as punctuation, as an exclamation point on the point I'm trying to make to really drive it home. And that was the first and most probably important thing I learned, using the video essay medium to communicate, which I think is essential, because if you're making video essays, on some level, I think you need to justify why it's a video essay and not a written essay. What does it gain in the audiovisual format that it wouldn't have in the written format? Bart asks, what do you see yourself doing 10 years from now? Probably still making new episodes of Bergman Cinema. Like, do you see how fucking big this box is? I'm never gonna finish this series. So that wraps up our first Q&A. I want to say thank you to everyone who sent in questions, and to all my subscribers. Your support really means a lot. I hope you check out my Patreon, and I'll see you again soon.
Your friend, D.